Sphinx, the metaphorical creature, the Sphinx, was a favourite subject of the Surrealists, but for Leonor Fini it was really her defining subject. She, of all the Surrealists, was most concerned about using the Sphinx and the meanings, the various meanings that the Sphinx could have. I say she of all the Surrealists because, having said that, she always denied that she was a Surrealist. So what I want to talk about is the extent to which we can call her a Surrealist, and the way in which her work relates to Surrealism. So that really is my subject. And the artist herself, of course, is no longer alive, but she was one of the longest living of the people associated with Surrealism. She died in 1996 at the age of 88. And at that time, of course, obituaries, as always happens, claimed that she was the last of the Surrealists, and she would not have been amused to hear that. Also, she was claimed to be the forerunner, or one of the forerunners, of feminist discourses relating to art in her obituary. Now, she would also not have been pleased to hear that, because she didn't like any labels, and she had, although she was flattered that feminist writers took an enormous amount of interest in her work later in her career, she always felt that if somebody was interested in her simply because she was a woman artist, then that was not the right basis. And the exhibition that we have here, Angels of Anarchy, which I think is a wonderful exhibition and really does give us a chance to discover work by many of the artists who related to Surrealism, whose work is not well known. Nevertheless, I feel that if she were here going around the exhibition, she would have made a few little remarks about why we should consider it necessary. Well, of course, I would have to answer that as long as the women whose work related to Surrealism are still so little known, we need opportunities to see that work, and this exhibition is a wonderful opportunity for that. And one must congratulate Manchester for putting on such a show. This is a photograph of Leonor by Dora Maar, another artist who was associated with the Surrealists. Dora Maar, this photograph is in the exhibition, as was the painting you saw a minute ago by Leonor. An interesting picture taken in 1936. Leonor had recently arrived in Paris from Italy. She was born in Argentina. Her father was Argentinian, but she was brought up in Italy, in Trieste, that wonderful cosmopolitan city in northern Italy. She was brought up by her mother. Her father was a rather brutal man, and her mother had to leave and flee to Italy. And her father used to send over people to capture her and to take her back. So there were some very awkward moments in her early life. And in fact, she was dressed as a boy whenever she went out. And it's quite interesting that her love of dressing up and her love of blurring the boundaries, her love of metamorphosis, ambiguity, these are elements, these are crucial elements in the story of Surrealism. These are all also elements relating to her work, and I think one can find clues to that in her early life. She was self-taught. She taught herself by going to Italian museums, and she made her way to Milan, where she worked for a time with the Metaphysical School and became a close friend of Giorgio de Chirico. For the rest, they were very close friends the rest of their lives, and she realized that the place where things were happening, 1929-30, the place where things were happening was Paris. And so therefore she made her way to Paris and immediately became quite well known amongst the artists of Paris. Dora Maar has photographed her in her studio. She had a beautiful studio she arranged. It was very typical of her, beautiful sculptures and hanging curtains and things of this sort. And here she is. She's wearing a sort of décolleté slip. She has black stockings with rather prominent ladders down one leg. She's holding a black Baudelairean black cat between her legs, very symbolic, of course, in itself. The word pussy describes it both in French and in English. So the image is full of symbolism, if you like. It's full of sexuality. It's full of... she confronts us and she is nobody's fool. She's a very independent woman who's very sure of her sexuality, and this describes her very well. And it perhaps gives us some idea about how she became so well known so early on amongst the group of the Surrealists who welcomed her. Of course, the image that you have here is of other elements in her life. On the one hand, the Sphinx. This is in her salon in later years. She collected Art Nouveau lamps and sculptures and objects, and she collected cats. These were the two essential elements in her life, the love of the Sphinx, and so she collected sculptures of the Sphinxes, and her love of cats. She had, throughout her life, she had cats, more and more of them towards the end of her life. They practically took over her life, as we shall see later on. Photograph in the exhibition of Lee Miller. Lee Miller photographed herself, self-portrait by Lee Miller, 1940, with sphinxes again. Sphinxes were, as I say, a fascination. The meaning of the Sphinx, the mythological world that was inhabited by the concept of the Sphinx, and what the Sphinx meant to individual artists is something which we'll be talking about in this lecture. Amongst the first people she met in Paris was the photographer Cartier Bresson, and he became a lifelong friend, and he took some extraordinary photographs of her at this time, which give us an idea about what a pretty extraordinary person she already was. This is 1932 in the Clignancourt flea market. And here we have a very famous photograph of her with her friend André Pierre de Mondial, the French writer, who was also a lifelong friend, whom she met when she arrived in Paris. And he and she were on a trip to Italy, and this is at Trieste in the bathing Lido. They had hired some Belle Époque costumes, and they were parading and posing for Cartier Bresson. And a photograph which is Cartier Bresson. I talked to him towards the end of his life all about Leonor Fini, by whom he was absolutely fascinated in the 30s and from then on. He showed me this photograph which he took at her at the same time. She took of her at the same time in Italy on that trip. And he called it Nude Italy, and it's become quite well known. And he never divulged who the model was because he thought maybe it was politer. But after Leonor's death, he allowed me to reproduce it in my book and actually give it the title of Leonorfini. So Henri Cartier-Bresson, André Pierre de Mondial, and another person she met was Max Ernst. Max Ernst was already well established. He'd been in the Dada group, and he was by now, of course, one of the leading figures in Surrealism. And he had quite a reputation for having various attachments, shall we say. And he met Leonor at a party. She was in great demand because she had met Elsa Schiaparelli, and Elsa Schiaparelli used to lend her latest costumes because Leonor was so beautiful, and because she was seen at a lot of parties. She would wear these fabulous costumes, and people would say, "My God, where did you get that?" And she'd say, "From Elsa Schiaparelli." And Max Ernst fell for her immediately, and they became lovers for quite a while. And Max Ernst was entré into the Surrealist group. This is a photograph of the Surrealist group at the Café de la Place Blanche, where Breton, the leader of the group, used to hold court. Breton is at the back on the right, and then next to him is Yves Tanguy, and at the end of the back row is Man Ray. In front of Man Ray, I think he's got his hands on his shoulders in the jacket there, that's Salvador Dali. Two along, that's Max Ernst. I haven't managed to identify the others. The others were poet members of the group. This was taken at exactly this time. It's characteristic that this shows only men. There are many photographs of the Surrealists at this time. They used to love being photographed, doing weird things or just sitting in a cafe or whatever. But the photographs that we have, every single one of them is just the men. The men used to get together in the cafe. The men used to sign the manifestos. There was this sense in which the men were the artists, and the men were the artists, and the women were lovers or wives or attachments. Leonor herself was not prepared to be thought of in these terms. She was not prepared to be initiated into the circle of friends of André Breton simply because she was the lover of Max Ernst. She considered that if she was of interest because she was Leonorfini. Characteristically, she had great sense of her abilities. At one of the first meetings at the Café de la Place Blanche, where Max Ernst took her in 1934, I think it was 33, she appeared in a very brief outfit with long pink silk cardinal's stockings, which she'd bought in a vestment shop in Rome. And Breton was absolutely delighted. Of course, the Surrealists were all Catholics, and here was this extraordinary woman subverting the religion by wearing the cardinal's outfit, and also a sort of transvestism, the idea of the woman wearing the man's outfit. And they immediately thought she was one of them, but she actually laughed, and she said she only wore them because she loved the colour. So she was making it clear that she had her own agenda. She didn't feel happy with Breton's sexism. She felt that his attitude towards the women in the group was very much that of they were beautiful, they were wonderful, they were inspiration, they might be mistresses, they in some way embodied the various aspects of muse to the male artists. The femme enfant, the woman who was rather like a young girl, the femme fatale, the woman who was projecting her sexuality. And she herself felt that this rather devalued, and she wasn't alone in this. We know that Leonora Carrington felt this, another of the artists associated with the group, and later wife of Max Ernst. Merit Oppenheim, she is on record as having said exactly the same. Frida Kahlo, Dorothy Tanning, later wife of Max Ernst, and other women artists associated with Surrealism had this view that they were not being considered on the terms which they valued. Partners, Leonora Carrington, who used to be very much part of the group when she was married to Max Ernst. Frida Kahlo, she used to be welcomed with her husband Diego Rivera. Max Ernst's later wife, Dorothea Tanning, but Stursky, who was brought along by Troyen. These were the situations which they felt were rather insulting. She told me in a conversation, "It was very encouraging for me to meet other artists, and they seemed impressed that I was intelligent, well-read and talented, but I disliked the deference with which everyone treated Breton. I hated his anti-homosexual attitudes and also his misogyny. It seemed that the women were expected to keep quiet in cafe discussions, yet I felt I was just as good as the men. Breton seemed to me to expect devotion like a pope and wanted me to become a mouton dans sa troupe, a sheep in his gang. I enjoyed all the attention I received, but I refused to join the group. I never saw the point of being part of one group, and I disliked Breton's habit of holding tribunals, excommunicating wayward surrealists like Dali and Giacometti, publishing lists of books one shouldn't read. I've never been very interested in ideologies, and I refused the label surrealist. It seemed that everything strange was called surrealist in the 30s. I saw more differences than similarities between myself and the surrealists. I was never a surrealist. I preferred to walk alone." Having said that, of course, as I hope to demonstrate, her work does show very strong similarities and influences from surrealism. Breton's book, Surrealism and Painting, I hope they'll have to come back again. Modern technology and I don't always get on, I'm afraid, but I've got somebody to help me here. Breton's painting, Surrealism and Painting, Breton's book, Surrealism and Painting, was first published in 1925. There's no mention at all of any woman artist. The last edition was 1965, and there were short mentions of one or two people, like Leonora Carrington and Frida Kahlo. No mention at all of Leonor. It's a paradox that Breton's surrealism consistently failed to give women artists their due, and yet at the same time one has to say that his movement allowed more women to become prominent artists than any other movement of artists in the 20th century. It's an extraordinary paradox. When you think that in the second manifesto he said, the problem of women is all that is marvellous and troubling in the world. The problem of women is all that is marvellous and troubling in the world. And this idea that, women were a problem. You had to think about them. Women were femme fatale, women were femme enfant, they were sorceresses, they were sphinxes, they were muses, and that somehow this was a problem. Leonor certainly tried surrealist techniques. Here's an automatic drawing. She did automatic drawings along with the surrealist in the 30s. She tried in this way to communicate with the subconscious, which is one, of course, of the main early techniques which the surrealists employed. The idea that you're just going to sleep and you start drawing, or you wake up in the morning and you start drawing, or maybe you take a few illicit substances and then you try and draw without any control. This idea of trying to exercise your talent without any conscious control was a way they felt that you could reach the unconscious, and she was interested in this idea for a while, but in the end she felt that there was need for direction, and therefore for her automatic drawing was not the direction she wanted to go in. The definition by André Breton in the first manifesto of surrealism in 1924, surrealism believes in the omnipotence of the dream. Now there she would be in agreement. She also felt that the dream, the world of dreams, opened up magnificent highways of exploration, that in your state of dreams you were experiencing things which you couldn't possibly experience in your waking hours, and if you could somehow communicate with your dreams, you could find the source of an art which would revolutionize the world. This is what Breton thought, and she agreed with this, and therefore she agreed very much with Freud's book on in the interpretation of dreams. But she actually had more admiration for Jung. She felt that Jung's concern with the imagination, the concern with the creative faculties, was much stronger than you find in the writings of Freud. Surrealism in the mid-30s began to become famous beyond France, beyond Paris. This is a photograph taken in London in 1936, in May, the exhibition, the first exhibition of surrealism. This was the International Surrealist Exhibition, June 1936, and it was a revelation to people in London. Various artists were invited to exhibit. Breton, of course, was the presiding genius, Herbert Reed in England. This is a photograph I discovered only quite recently, and you can see the Man Ray, Observatory of the Lovers, on the top. You can see on the right-hand side Max Ernst, the Elephant of Celebes, in the Tate Gallery. Either side of the doorway are two paintings by Leonor Fini, and she was one of the artists represented. Before that, in May, she'd been represented at the exhibition of Surrealist Objects, where Belmer's doll and Dali's aphrodisiac jacket and Duchamp's bottle rack and things of that sort. She exhibited an extraordinary large leather-bound book, which was all sort of badly damaged. It was called Cover of a Book That Has Spent Time in the Sea, and it had been very badly damaged by water, and there were seashells stuck into it and all this. It was absolute fake. It had never been near the sea, but it was her contribution to this. So she was very willing to exhibit with the surrealists, and in fact absolutely delighted. But the exhibition didn't go down too well with the English public, and her own contribution, the painting this is the only one that we now know, the only one that survived of those paintings. This is called The Game of Legs in a Key of Dreams, which she had painted in 1935. And it's a sort of rather polite image, a very precise, carefully controlled image of two figures, obviously a woman in very tight clothing and high heels and sort of ripped clothing, long black hair, and then another rather androgynous figure in front who's some sort of ceremonial act and is caressing her ankle. It's quite extraordinary for her sort of beginnings of working with and alongside the surrealist. The Daily Mail was not happy with her paintings. A couple of slaps on the face of decency that should not be allowed to pass unnoticed, said the Daily Mail to Leonor Fini. She was always horrified when people didn't like her work, and when she had bad reviews, she always felt it very personally. And of course, for an artist, that's not a good idea, because modern art and contemporary art and the art that she was trying to represent at the cutting edge, though I'm afraid the history is, of course, that the likes of the Daily Mail don't usually like it. Another person who didn't go down too well was Salvador Dali at the exhibition. Salvador Dali decided to give a lecture, but he wanted to show that he was descending into the subconscious, as Freud wanted him to do. So he wore a diver's outfit, and he strode with difficulty onto the stage in the gallery and started speaking. But unfortunately, it hadn't been realized that he wouldn't be able to breathe. And so actually he began to puff and wheeze, and he was trying to gesture that he was dying. And fortunately, somebody in the audience rushed forward and had some form of device, and they managed to unscrew, and Dali survived to live another day. Here is Leonor again, and the exhibition was considered by the Surrealists a great success and was part of their desire to move forwards from a position of being French and acknowledged as a French movement. And so Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, invited them to exhibit. And so he had an exhibition, and at the same time, Leonor was invited by Julian Levy, the American dealer, to have a two-person show, she and Max Ernst, at his gallery. And so she went off to New York. And here she is at the exhibition. It was called Fantastic Art, Dada and Surrealism. It opened in December 1936, and her show with Max Ernst was on at roughly the same time. A Tanguy painting on her right, and her own painting again, the painting that we've just seen on her left. And this introduced Surrealism to the USA, and it's interesting again that Leonor Fini was very much involved. She spent her time in New York. She'd never been to America. She didn't speak English, but she had a guide in the artist Chelichev who took her around to, and he said the places she must visit were not galleries, but freak shows and burlesque houses with striptease. He said this was characteristic of New York of the 30s. She had never been to such places before, but she was quite interested until the owner of Minsky's burlesque house, who thought she was very beautiful, immediately invited her to join his girls. And she replied rather beautifully, "No, I am a painter." Her time in New York was followed by the press because she had already a reputation for being an unusual sort of person. The New York Times said, "She has all sorts of queer notions in her head, and some of them are not quite nice." She felt that New York was ripe for surrealism, but it was not to be a great success in the eyes of the press. I found an article from the New York Sunday Mirror. "What Surrealism is all about" was the article. It was subheaded "The World's Balmiest Human Menagerie," and there was a photograph of Leonor Fini to illustrate. "The female of the surrealist species is vividly represented by Miss Leonor Fini, a lush, plump blonde who wears jet black fingernail polish, dyes her hair blue, orange, red or gold as the mood dictates, and consults a psychoanalyst to discover the meaning of her own paintings. She is 28, a strange racial fusion of German, Italian, Slav and Argentine. She is startlingly, flashily attractive in the Hollywood siren tradition. She arrived in New York several weeks ago speaking only French and Italian to supervise the exhibition of her picture, Game of Legs in a Key of Dreams. Surrealists are strong on strange titles." Well, once the exhibition was over, she received a message from Joseph Cornell. Joseph Cornell was one of the best-known American artists who were very interested in surrealism, who we would talk about today as American surrealists. He loved her paintings, and in particular this one that's disappeared, The Lost Needle, a strange sort of sorceress-like figure with a bandage over her eye, which was actually inspired by a photograph of the poet Apollinaire, who had, of course, invented the word surrealism. And so he said to her that he would love to have a drawing by her. So she gave him this drawing, which was the preparatory drawing for the painting. And then she also gave him a photograph of herself, and then she wrote a little message to him, and he received these in an envelope and was absolutely overwhelmed. And he made this, what he called homage to Leonor Fini, joint work, which is now in the Chicago Art Gallery. It's a sort of joint work with these two artists. When Leonor got back to Paris, she was quite determined to continue the direction that she had already started in with the painting that we saw that was exhibited in York and London, and so she painted a series of images of witches and sorcerers. This one here is the La Sorcière, the witch of 1935 to 36. She was fascinated especially with the idea that witches and sorcerers were considered to be evil, dangerous people. She loved the idea of a witch or a sorceress, or somebody who was different, somebody who was sure of themselves, somebody who had power. She did a series of paintings of witches with broomsticks. This girl here, with her broomstick, her clothing is revealing her body. She seems to be proud of herself, proud of her body, proud of her power, and she's sweeping away debris, the normal debris of life, in order to present herself to us as almost a goddess, and yet she is seen in terms of the witch. Now, this isn't actually such a surprising idea, because the book by Michelet, La Sorcière, Jules Michelet, which had come out rather earlier, Breton loved this book, and so did the Surrealists, and Michelet's idea was that the witch had been misinterpreted, the idea of witch, riding on a broomstick and having her familiars and going to the Sabbath, and that the witch actually was a powerful and beautiful woman, and that you could trace this through imagery such as Hans Baldwin Green. So Leonor felt that she was very much in that line, working in the same direction. So she produced a series of works, which are amongst her most surrealist work, the image here, and pictures which are in that line of exploring. This one is called the Sleepless Day, or the Curious Woman of 1936. Images like this, which are set in a strange sort of barren landscape in which strange, extraordinary things are happening. A door that appears from nowhere with an old woman looking through at the witch herself, or the sorcerer, who maybe is quite going to exact revenge or discipline. She's holding some form of instrument in her hand. This one here, that's the Max Ernst. This is another one, Max Ernst painting of Woman, Old Man and Flower of 1924. You can see how she has gained from her relationship with Max Ernst and the awareness of Max Ernst's work. The figure looking through the door, the strange landscape, the strange figure in the foreground, elements which she takes from that sort of dream world which the surrealists are exploring at the same time. The work I seem to be jumping here, don't I? Wait a minute, let me go back again. There we are. The works that she produces include group images, such as this one here, the intermission of the apotheosis. This one is called, and the woman is displaying her naked body. The witch, the sorceress, is displaying her naked body to a group of older women. They may be Greek furies, they may themselves be the more wicked side of the world of witches. They seem to be angry participants in some sort of very pagan apotheosis, as the title suggests. So this is the direction that she explores at this time, and the person who most inspires her is Hans Baldwin Green, who we saw on the front of Michelet's book. He did many drawings of witches and sexual games in early 16th century Germany, when witches were a great preoccupation of the Protestant church. And it was felt that artists were taking much too much interest in the more sexual aspects of the figure of the witch. Her friend Schiaparelli opened a shop in Paris at this time, and Leonor was very much part of her world, and Schiaparelli invited Leonor to design her latest perfume, which was called Shocking. And so Leonor designed the bottle that you see here. It was based on a sort of tailor's mannequin, but inspired by the hourglass figure of Mae West. Mae West was, of course, a great favourite of the surrealists. Salvador Dali was one of many people who was absolutely infatuated with her. This introduced Leonor to the world of commercial art. Now, Breton said that no self-respecting surrealist would have anything to do with the world of commercial art. Leonor and various other artists disagreed with this, and in fact she became very much part of that idea of trying to introduce surrealism beyond the borders of exhibitions, beyond the borders of cafe meetings and manifesto writing and things of that sort. In particular, by the way, I was going to say, some of you may recognize this, Jean-Paul Gaultier in 1995 produced a bottle almost identical to this for his latest perfume. Leo Castelli opened a gallery, and in 1939 he and Schiaparelli owned this gallery. It was next door to Schiaparelli's shop, and they invited Leonor to organize their first exhibition, and she decided it should be an exhibition of furniture. An extraordinary idea, surrealist furniture. It was an enormous success. The images, the objects which they got together, and which she got together for the exhibition. The anthropomorphic wardrobe is this one here, with women swans. Some of you will have seen some of these in the Victoria and Albert Museum's exhibition of surrealism and design of a couple of years ago. The anthropomorphic wardrobe, women swans, which Leonor designed for the exhibition, and two door panels, painting and architecture. She also designed a chair. This is the corset chair which she designed for the exhibition. And there were all sorts of extraordinary things in her exhibition. This is the Hans chair made by Salvador Dali. And of course we know Salvador Dali's sofa in the shape of Mae West's lips. Merritt Oppenheim produced the bird table, a bird's leg table. This is actually in the permanent collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and many of these things were in the Victoria and Albert's exhibition. The world that she had entered into was very much part of surrealism now, that surrealism did need to widen its scope. But her main concern was painting, and the paintings that she produced at this time are a series of fantasy paintings that really lie at the beginning of her mature work. The images, this one here is called Figures on a Terrace of 1938. The idea that dreams, she did agree, as I said before, with Breton, that Freud's world of dream interpretation was important for an artist, but she said, I do not say that my paintings are dreams. This is Leonor to me. No, I say they contain the mechanism of dreams. She saw this as a difference, that if you just painted your dreams, you were just trying to reproduce something automatically. If you were containing the mechanism of dreams, you were then consciously trying to work out what you were painting, and she saw a distinction there. But they certainly have a sort of dream-like quality, this terrace with a figure who is Leonor herself on the left in a Schiaparelli dress, another lady, both with extraordinary manes of hair, and a woman appearing at the back, and then two other men who they don't seem to be communicating with at all. Her pink cardinal silk stockings are hanging in the middle there, and there's a witch's broomstick in the corner at the back above the man's head. So there are references to things in her life and in her work that come through. And also this diptych, the double painting from one day to another. Very precise, strong imagery is very characteristic of the development of her work. Interesting, on the one side is the scene at night, the architecture and the pool with strange detritus floating on the water. And then the scene on the right where the architecture has been damaged in some form of attack. And then strange women have appeared. Again, Leonor herself standing in the middle with the long hair, and then other women with her. And they are sort of disporting themselves. They seem to be totally uninterested in the men. The men in the painting, there's a man on the left-hand side who's naked but bandaged. And there's a man on the right-hand side who seems to be emerging from some form of lion outfit. And then there's a man at the back on the left who's tied to a chair being attacked by chickens. So you can imagine all sorts of rather unpleasant thoughts about men seem to be emerging. And she also talked about what she felt was an approaching cataclysm. I mean, this is, of course, 1939, shortly before war was to be declared. Another painting from this period is The Ceremony, and she was quite prolific. She produced a lot of work at this time, and she tried to follow on from the idea of woman as a powerful being in a male world, the idea which, in retrospect, of course, we talk about patriarchy, we talk about a world where men are in control and where women have to fight for their own sense of control. So here is herself on the right-hand side, and she's wearing some sort of armour, partly because of what she felt coming in the world around her and war approaching, partly because, of course, women armed, one thinks of Joan of Arc, one thinks of the idea of chivalry, protection against evil, respect for ancient gods, that these are elements that she's bringing in, and then there's the woman naked to the waist on the right-hand side who seems to be performing some form of sacrifice or some form of ritual at some altar where Leonor is protecting her. And this continues with The Black Room of 1939. Here is her friend Leonora Carrington. Leonora Carrington was an English, and she'd gone to Paris because of the exhibition, the English exhibition of Surrealism, and she'd met Max Ernst. Max Ernst, as I say, did have an eye for the young ladies, and he had a relationship with her, so she followed him to Paris and became his lover for some years, and became also a great friend of Leonor Fini. And she wears the armour now. She's standing triumphantly, powerful guardian or protector of the figures in the background. So Leonor is working along a certain pretty clear direction with her images of women, empowered women. Leonora Carrington and Max Ernst fled when the war broke out. Max Ernst was, of course, German and was more at risk than most, and they fled south to Provence. Leonor also felt that she was endangered. Many artists did. A large contingent of surrealists, of course, left Paris to go to New York during the war. Leonor decided to go south with her lover at the time, who was Mondial, the writer, and they stayed with Max Ernst and Leonora Carrington in Provence for a time, and she painted this portrait of Leonora Carrington. Leonora Carrington and Max Ernst's relationship was very close, but Max Ernst was soon discovered when the Germans invaded France, and Max Ernst was arrested and taken to the concentration camp at Aix-en-Provence, where he found Hans Bellmer, another of the surrealists, German surrealists. The two of them had both been caught, and they were in great danger in the concentration camp there. Leonora Carrington tried desperately to intervene on their behalf. As an English person, she felt she had certain power that she could use, but it was to no avail, and she lost her reason, and she wrote most terrible, pathetic letters to Leonor. And then, because she was so terrified that she wouldn't know what to do, one day she exchanged the house that she had lived in with Max Ernst. When somebody offered her a bottle of brandy and she felt she desperately needed a drink, she handed over the deeds to the house to accept the bottle. So she had, and somebody else said they liked this painting. The one thing then that she had was of value, and so she gave him the painting, and so she was homeless and desperate during this period, although friends took her in and looked after her, and she would come back into the story. Leonor made her way to Monte Carlo. Here we are. Here is a self-portrait that she did at this time. Self-portraiture. Self-portraiture is a very important subject for women associated with surrealism. Well, not just for them, of course, but in particular for them. The idea that you self-assertion as an independent artist, an artist who does not depend on the relationship with a man. The idea that you are representing yourself and your art, you're representing yourself as an individual, independent being. One thinks of many of the artists, the women artists associated. But for Leonor, the technique, this very, very precise Renaissance-inspired technique, of course, continues in her work. The sort of torn clothing that we've seen before. The glove, very interesting, with the scorpion's tail coming out of the glove. A little sort of very clear surrealist touch. And another one is the self-portrait in a blue dress. This is 1941. When she's in Monte Carlo, which was a haven, a wonderful haven for people like her, of course, because it was an independent principality. She presents herself in a very forthright way, very clear that she's proud of her femininity, she's proud of being a woman, but the way her hand is presented, the way the prominence of the hand, that she's drawing attention to the fact that she is an artist, that she works with her hand, and that she represents something more than simply an object for the pleasure of men in the surrealist group. And the most strange of this series is the self-portrait with Chimera. The self-portrait with Chimera is of somewhere around about 1939, 1940, probably when she was in the South. Leonor shows herself with a sort of feathered costume, feathered wings, a tail, long black hair again, and then in the foreground, I'm sorry, it's not absolutely clear, there's a chimera. A chimera is a fabulous beast who's made up of parts made from various animals and humans. In mythology, in Greek mythology, the original chimera was the daughter of Typhon, who was the most fearful of mythical creatures. Leonor has, rather like the witch, she's taken an emblem like this, an emblem of fear and of sexual fascination to the male surrealists, and she's not shown it as some evil, wicked presence. There's a parallel between the figure of Leonor and the figure of the devil, of the wicked being, of the chimera, that she seems to be maybe protecting the chimera, showing sisterhood with the chimera, instead of the normal way of seeing these beasties, these horrible... This is a Spanish Romanesque image, for instance, of chimeras attacking each other. So again, she's taking an acceptable, a mythological, an image which has been of use to artists from mythology, and she is using that in the course of her work. And a most extraordinary result of this determination was the Shepherdess of the Sphinxes. And this is also 1941, when she's in Monte Carlo. It's Leonor herself again, with all this black hair. Again, she's wearing the armour, the armoured image of herself, naked except for the armour. And she is protecting a group of women sphinxes. Here are the sphinxes of my title. We're not now concerned with the chimera, we're now concerned with the Sphinx. The Sphinx was believed to be another daughter of Typhon, in fact, so therefore the sister, the original Sphinx, the sister of the chimera. But these are not fearful, destroying beings. These seem to be a sort of a group of these sphinxes who are being looked after, shepherded by Leonor herself as the emblem of protection, the guardian of these mythological beings, these mythological themes which she's exploring. This painting had an interesting history because it's sort of a ceremony that she's representing, which she felt was important, and also the idea of metamorphosis, the idea of things ever changing, that things couldn't be trusted simply to remain the same, that they could be interpreted by different people, that everything was up for grabs, that you didn't just accept the basic interpretation you were given. That, of course, in itself is a very surrealist idea, the idea of metamorphosis. Also the idea of ambiguity, this idea, what is actually happening here? Is she protecting them, or is she attacking them? Is she sweeping them away, or is she shepherding them? What is actually happening? Ambiguity and metamorphosis are two crucial words that we use in relation to surrealist imagery, and we can certainly use them in relationship to Leonor Fini. and sexual power, sexuality. These are elements which she is channeling through her concern with mythology in these works. Max Ernst had managed to escape, as did Belmer later, from the concentration camp. Max Ernst had managed to get to Lisbon. But on his way, he was in Marseille, where there was a group of surrealists who were waiting to escape from France. And while he was there, he realized that Leonor had managed to get to Monte Carlo. So, secretly, Max Ernst made his way to Monte Carlo to see his former lover, Leonor. Leonor had just finished this painting. It's quite a small painting, and he thought it was absolutely fascinating, and he had a new lover by then. As I say, he got through quite a few ladies, and his new lover was Peggy Guggenheim, of the Guggenheim family, and she was with him in Marseille, so he asked her to come over, and she had plenty of money from the Guggenheim family, and so he persuaded her to buy the painting. They then got to Lisbon, where planes and boats were collecting in order to take intellectuals from France and Italy to America as the Germans spread through France. And Leonora Carrington, she had recovered from her difficulty, her mental difficulty, so she managed to get to Lisbon, hearing that Max Ernst was there. So therefore, Max Ernst was there, he had his lover Peggy Guggenheim, he had his lover Leonorfini had arrived. I'm sorry, his lover Leonor, I'm getting a bit confused. Leonor Carrington had arrived, so he very quickly wrote to Leonorfini and said, hurry on over and join us, and the four of us will go to America together. Leonor was not entirely happy to be made part of a harem like this, and so she refused. So, in fact, Peggy Guggenheim got passage for Max and herself. She was not able to get passage for Leonora Carrington, so she was left behind, and Leonorfini was not really keen to join this little activity. The paintings that Leonor continues to produce, this is the alcove of 1941 to 42, and this is the way forward. This is the way her career is now going to move. She is going to take up the idea of woman as herself, represented in some way in relation to the figure of the male. There's going to be this conjunction of the female and the male, and the female is always going to be the active participant or the protector or the threatening being, and man is going to be either asleep or submissive. This is a theme which he is now going to follow through. So the androgynous young man lies in bed asleep with the figure of Leonor herself naked beside him, and of course again, this idea of ambiguity. Is she Judith to his Holofernes? Is she about to cut off his head? Is it Venus and is it Psyche and Cupid? What is the relationship? You're left, of course, uncertain, because that is deliberate. And this is a theme she follows. This is a painting I found in a private collection in Italy. It was quite unknown. A woman. When you do this, if there's no title, you have to give it a title if you're going to publish it. And of course, Leonor would have had some wonderful title, but you can't make up a wonderful title. You have to. So, in order to identify it, I call it a woman seated on naked man. But that is the way in which the dramatic situation is continuing, and it continues towards an absolutely crucial work. The Sphinx Amelburger of 1942. I'm sorry, this has disappeared, and that's why I'm afraid we don't have a black and white photograph. The dominant female, the passive male, the rather androgynous male. Leonor always insisted that she did not like very macho men who spent their life trying to be so male and dominate women, that she liked men who were much more gentle and much more aware of their feminine side. And this, of course, she was rather ahead of her time. The Sphinx has the flowing hair of Leonor, and she is now representing herself quite clearly as the Sphinx, as opposed to just a woman. It's now again in this sort of strange desert landscape. She's either fondling his neck, or else she's about to strangle him. Again, you see, you're not at all sure what the situation that she has set up is. And of course, this is quite deliberate. The progression from the alcove is of course, now, although its composition is reversed, it's the same idea. So Leonor has now become the Sphinx, and the Sphinx is in this dual situation of being threatening or being a guardian. But either way, she is drawing again on the idea of mythology. She was very keen on the work of Piero di Cosimo. She loved the painting by Cosimo in the National Gallery, The Death of Procris, about 1500. She also loved, well, we're on Piero. When she was in London with Max Ernst for the exhibition earlier, she insisted on taking him to the National Gallery to see Venus, Cupid, Folly and Time by Piero di Cosimo, which she considered one of the great works of art. The actual image of the recumbent figure in a lot of these paintings, she said, was inspired directly by Lucas Cranach, the nymph at the fountain of 1509. She was, of course, very much a student of art and of the history of art. She loved Giroud's Sleep of Endymion in the Louvre, 1791, again, where you have the beautiful image of the man, the naked body of the man, and the figure above, and the way that the figure is lit up by this sort of magic light. This idea of taking mythology and using it for your own ends, of course, is something which we find at its most obvious in other artists. In Salvador Dali, the Metamorphosis of Narcissus in the Tate Gallery, again, the metamorphosis, the idea of taking the image of Narcissus, who fell in love with his reflection in the water, and then the way the image in rock is then repeated as a hand holding an egg from which the narcissus flower grows. This idea of using this as an arena for dreamlike interpretation is something which is very typical of Surrealism, very typical of Dali. Here is his image of Leda and the Swan, based, of course, on his wife Gala. And it's something which Max Ernst invented an alter ego for himself of Loplop the bird, because when he was a child, he had a pet parakeet, and one night his beloved parakeet was found dead in the cage when he got up in the morning, and he was absolutely heartbroken. And his father announced that he now had a sister. His mother had had a child in the night, and he was quite certain that the child had taken away the life of his bird in order to live. So he hated his sister on the one hand, and on the other hand he loved birds. And so later, as an artist, he used the image of the mythological bird Loplop as his sort of alter ego in the way that Leonor uses the Sphinx. So the Sphinx is to become the subject which he uses during this period, the little guardian Sphinx, one of many images. This one is of 1943 to 44, with the long mane of black hair as before, a mysterious image on a sort of altar, which has been cracked open by a dead plant, and then there are things like there's an alchemical implement on the corner, and some sort of secret parchment. And obviously there are all sorts of references to alchemy, references to mythology. The broken eggshells, which can be both concerned with death and destruction, but can also be concerned with rebirth. So the image of the Sphinx becomes very characteristic. One might just think for a moment about the Sphinx. The Sphinx, of course, was a favourite subject in Greek art. As I said before, the Sphinx was also the daughter, as was the idea of the descendant from the wickedest powers in Greek art, as the Chimera, that they were actually sisters. But the Sphinx had certain characteristics. She's always shown with a lion's body and the head of a woman, and is usually either kneeling or recumbent. The metamorphosis between the human and the animal is important, of course, in the case of the Sphinx, and also the link between man and the gods, the idea that it's half... It's clearly not human, it's clearly not animal, it's a sort of godlike creation. The image is found in, of course, its most famous form, the Sphinx in Egypt at Giza, where it has become one of the great monuments of the world, and that's the one that everyone thinks of. But the Sphinx itself is most famous in art and literature because the Sphinx used to, apparently, one of the legends, she was at the entrance to the city of Thebes in Egypt, and she would only allow travellers to enter Thebes if they could answer a riddle, and she would set them a riddle, and if they couldn't answer it, she strangled them and ate them, so she wasn't a nice lady, though. And along came Oedipus, and Oedipus was quite clever, and he answered the riddle. And so he killed her, so that was the end of the Sphinx. That is one of the stories of the Sphinx that has very particularly intrigued people. One thinks of Ingres, the neoclassical French artist, with his image of Oedipus and the Sphinx in the National Gallery in London. And also later Gustave Moreau of the surrealist, the symbolist, the French symbolist, with his image of the Sphinx, who seems to now be somehow fascinated by the beautiful young image of Oedipus and sort of clawing at him, as if not so much to kill him, as if perhaps to make love to him. So this idea of the link becomes stronger with Franz von Stuck, one of the artist that Leonor especially admired, of the symbolist group, the German artist. When he paints the Sphinx, he paints her as some form of powerful sexual being, and indeed in some of the paintings in a very strong sexual embrace, whether it's with Oedipus or whether it's simply the Sphinx and one of her captured. Leonor, of course, or the feminist interpretation of this would be, of course, that she is the femme fatale, and man is in her thrall, and she's going to bring about the death and the destruction of the man through her sexual powers as a femme fatale. And one of the most famous is the one by Knopf, the Belgian surrealist, of Art or the Caresses of the Sphinx of 1896, which follows on this idea. In the surrealist group, Max Ernst used the Sphinx a great deal, especially in La Semaine de Bonté, this series of collages that he did as a sort of novel, page and page of collages, in 1934, when Leonor was his lover. She remembers how he put these things together. He just he cut up Victorian engravings and scattered them around, and she remembered he used to say to her, throw a few of these along the floor and let's have a look at them. And then they'd look at them all and decide here was something wonderful, and he'd stop and he'd get some glue and stick them together, and in that way he felt that he was using his subconscious to create extraordinary images like this one here of the sort of bird-headed being in a train compartment, and then in the foreground there are the legs of a presumably consumed individual, and then here is the Sphinx in the background looking into the carriage being attacked by rats, and all of this made up of disparate parts of a Victorian engraving, of course full of the violence that he saw inherent in the figure of the Sphinx. Leonor did some pretty intriguing images following through the Sphinx itself, sphinxes in strange underground scenes, the resonance, the historical parallels could be made to have in the most extraordinary situations. It's difficult perhaps to see that the Sphinx, here is the Sphinx, which sort of grows out of a rhizome, and you think of this as maybe just a scene of strange undergrowth in the manner of Dutch 17th century painters, but then suddenly here you see a great eye looking at you, so it's full of sort of strange mystery and suspense. And she did a series of Sphinx images of this sort. That one was called the Sphinx Regina, and this one was called the Sphinx Filagria. And here you can probably make out a bit more easily. And here is the Sphinx-like creature, whose body is actually a sort of strange rooted plant, and whose head and breasts are here. And then there's a death's head moth and a salamander and various skulls around her, like the Sphinx at the entrance to Thebes. And here, one of the most interesting, I think, of the images that she did in this direction was the Catonian deity watching over the sleep of a young man of 1946. No, I'm sorry, it isn't one, it's the one just coming up. Which is, I think, one of the most intriguing. I seem to have jumped a few. Just a moment, here we are. We'll get to it in a second. There we are, that's the one I wanted. This is the Catonian deity watching over the sleep of a young man of 1946. Catonian means of the earth in mythological terms, and she loved the word, and she loved the sound of the word. A beautiful young man in a strange landscape, lying either asleep or, one that is quite sure, watched over, guarded, or maybe under attack from this extraordinary Sphinx image, the black Sphinx in this case, again with Leonor's features. Very strong contrast, of course, between the colouring of the foreground, the colouring of the back, this extraordinary invention of the Sphinx, moving right away now from the sort of historical parallels and mythological parallels that we saw before. The passive male and the strength of the woman. This is the situation that she's setting up in this series of works which sort of build up into this interpretation. She had read Robert Graves, and in The White Goddess he talks about the mother of all living, the ancient power of fright and lust, the female or the queen bee whose embrace is death. And she wanted, very clearly, she wanted there to be that ambiguity as to whether she was setting up a scene of violence and violation, or whether she was setting up a scene of tenderness. This is Striges Amori, and in this one she uses the figure of the werewolf, another of these emblems, these animal emblems from mythology. The word means dark sorceress, and here is Leonor herself with an extraordinary headdress with a skull of an animal, and then the werewolf-like image, and then in the foreground again the man, who the man is now in the, as it were, being grown over by ivy and other things of that sort, the way the natural world seems to be taking over the man, whereas the woman is in power and in command. She had a clear idea about the difference between the male, who was subject to the ways of the world, and the female as a sort of goddess figure who was in touch with her real being and who was much more in power, much more deserving of being in power. She felt that men who wanted to go and fight wars, for instance, she felt was a terrible way that they tried to express their maleness, and she would therefore much prefer a man who would accept his androgyny, or a man who would accept his passivity, and not try to, as it were, bring death and destruction to the world. And to that extent she was quite a pacifist. There's a photograph here. I don't know why it does that, but it does sometimes. There we are. A photograph. I love modern technology. I really do. Here is a photograph of Leonor dressed for a ball. Now, by this time, we're now in the late 40s. She loved to present herself to the public as one of her paintings. She would not only produce these images of herself in the guise of the Sphinx, but she would then appear, and here we are, she is the Striges Amori, with the same headdress that she's used in the painting, and these sort of implements, and she would be invited to these fabulous balls that were held in the post-war period, where everyone dressed up in the most, well, not everyone, they were for the aristocracy and artists and writers. They would dress up in these extraordinary outfits, and they would go to these surrealist balls or whatever, and she would, because she had the reputation, she would be the one everyone waited for. So everyone would be there. She would always arrive late, and then someone would announce Leonorfini, and then people would open, apparently. The whole crowd would just open. And she would process through with her lover of the day, or two lovers usually. And she would then look in the nearest mirror and just gaze at herself, apparently. This is what she used to do. A long description to the sort of thing. And then if anyone dared to come and ask her to dance, she would just laugh and say, "What do you think I'm here for?" And then she would leave. And so everyone would then talk about her. And of course she absolutely loved that. Come back here. I don't know why it's doing that. There we are. The idea of the Sphinx is something which he took to quite an extent, and the idea of what the Sphinx could do, the one in the Tate Gallery, the little hermit Sphinx, which is in the exhibition, is her last image of the Sphinx. The being is now a smaller figure, again with her features in the bottom part of the canvas, peering out from a sort of lair in some sort of decaying building. Again, there are broken eggshells. We have the dual meaning of rebirth and also of fertility, but they're also bones of destruction. And there is hanging in the doorway, it's a part of human lungs, and it's very disturbing, I think, the duality, the metamorphosis which is represented, but also quite clearly this this ambivalence as to whether this is an evil figure or whether it's a protecting figure, or in what way it relates to the progression. But certainly it has that strange, disturbing, almost nightmare quality that is very typical of surrealism of that period. Self-portraiture I mentioned before, and this is an example also in the exhibition, artists who use self-portraits. And Leonor, of course, is at one here with Leonora Carrington, her self-portrait of 1936 to 37, drawing on Celtic legends. As I said, she was English, she was from the north of England. The horse is sacred to ancient Celtic tribes. The horse is there both in the manifestation outside the window and behind her. The hyena belongs to the fertile world of night, and the horse, she talked about the rebirth into the light of day, and the idea of nature as a source of power, power for herself, creative power for herself. She did a great deal of writing as well as painting at this time. So self-portraiture, as I said before, comes a sort of self-affirmation, not simply a straightforward portrait of the artist, but an artist in a very specific and very often mythological situation. Of course, other women associated with surrealism, they use their own private, their own personal tragedy, or their own situation that they found themselves in, such as Frida Kahlo, suffering all her life from the terrible bus accident she had when she was young. And so this becomes the way in the broken column that she presents herself. There's a big contrast here by the way the women are seen by the male artists of the surrealist group. Magritte's painting of Rape, where the woman's face is made up of the sexual parts of her body, and Salvador Dali with the young virgin, auto-sodomized by her own chastity of 1954, with the idea that she could pass her parts around for men to admire. Of course, this is very different from the way the female artists of the group are presenting the image of the female, i.e. themselves. One of Leonor's most famous paintings is The Ends of the Earth of 1948. A woman plunged in a swamp up to her breasts, the burning fires of hell behind her, maybe all sorts of skulls floating on the water, and detritus and stuff in the foreground, and the eyes especially prominent, as with that Sphinx filagria, the eyes of the real eyes inside the skeletons, and the eyes of Leonor herself also highlighted in the reflection. A very strong, can we call this a self-portrait? It's not called a self-portrait, it's called The Ends of the Earth. She said herself to me, "It's me, but not just me, it's the essence of the feminine. She's woman, symbol of beauty and deep knowledge. She emerges from the water, the essential element of life, because she knows how to survive the cataclysm." Quite clearly the idea is the same, that she is some sort of priestess, some person drawing on ancient powers to present herself as the survivor in the cataclysm. Another very dramatic painting of this period is The Angel of Anarchy of 1949. Now, ideas of death and destruction, which we've just been looking at, we can see here the way there's a sort of strange eroticization of death in this image of the figure, not quite clear whether it's male or female, or it may well be Leonor herself with a sort of long white wig, and then the skeletal form and parts of the underlying structure of the body, parts of the underlying musculature of the body are represented as well, and the figure has wings as an angel, as some sort of heavenly being, and is just dropping his or her robe and they're presenting themselves as the angel, presenting themselves as the Angel of Anatomy. The title itself comes from the idea comes from, or the image itself was inspired by the extraordinary illustrations by Gautier Dagoty of 1773 to his book of engravings and anatomical engravings for doctors and medical students, where he creates these vivid coloured images of the structures of the body. I mean, the works of art, of course, they're not anatomical diagrams as such. And this one here he actually called the anatomical angel, because the structure had been peeled back to create sort of angel's wings. And so Leonor has used that in a scientific sense to create an image really referring to death and sexuality. It's not surprising that the writer Georges Bataille, who wrote that extraordinary book Les Larmes d'Eros, The Tears of Eros, should have, who was a great friend of Leonor's, should have used the Angel of Anatomy by Leonor as one of the crucial images in his book. And then this is another of this series of self-portraits, or images of the self, rather than self-portraits, I think we should say. It's called The Ideal Life of 1950. And here Leonor sits with a sort of halo behind her, which actually was modelled on a paddle steamer wheel, which she found on the shore when she was down on the beach in the south of France. And then there she sets herself up in a sort of feathered headdress, surrounded by various felines, various cats, wild cats and domestic cats, her own cats, as a sort of waited upon, as it were, by these representatives, as herself as the image of the goddess at the centre of her kingdom. Woman as alchemist, woman as artist, and the rituals of art, as Griselda Pollock called it in her feminist analysis, an attempt to appropriate to women exactly the divine force, access to another level of experience, which has been the sacred and exclusive preserve of men. As I said before, Leonor was quite interested that feminist writers later in her life looked upon her work as being very important movements towards their ideas, and how they analysed her work along those lines. But as I say, she was not happy if somebody got in touch with her and said, you're a very interesting woman artist, can I come and talk to you? And she would say, are you coming to see me because I'm an interesting artist, or are you coming to see me because I'm an interesting woman artist? And if they say, well, my work is concerned with women, then she'd say, I'm not interested. So she didn't exactly encourage the respect which she was getting. A rather fine photograph which I found in the archives of the National Portrait Gallery. This is a photograph that wasn't known about by Cecil Beaton of Leonor at this time. And you can see the same idea. She's surrounded by her cats. She's in her world. She's got her painting paraphernalia around her. She's sure of herself, and she's also very beautiful. And she is very clearly using her beauty and her power physically and mentally as the source of the power that she gives to the figures in these paintings. We're getting towards the end of the period of Leonor's work in relationship to surrealism, and towards the end of my lecture. I don't want to overrun much. Three paintings of sacred goddesses, guardians of the egg, of 1954 to 55. These coloured eggs have alchemical and mythological significance. The egg is a symbol of new life. One thinks of Salvador Dali and his Narcissus painting. And the phoenix, a mythical bird, builds a nest of twigs and then ignites the nest and then is consumed, but the new bird arises out of the ashes. So the egg is now being used. We're moving away from the Sphinx. We're now using another mythological and indeed alchemical theme in the images taken. Of course, one can find examples. The goddess Cybele, a drawing from a Roman sculpture. And you think of Salvador Dali with some of his extraordinary images, the Geopoliticus child watching the birth of the new man of 1943 by Salvador Dali. And the last of the images I want to look at, the image of Friendship of 1958. It's extraordinary really, because here is, at its most simplified form, this idea of Death and the Maiden, the traditional medieval idea of Death and the Maiden, which of course the idea is vanitas, that women who admired themselves too much, they would be depicted with death as a skeleton behind them to remind them that all beauty is destroyed by death. But that idea is used by her rather in the manner of the Angel of Anatomy as a maybe a protective figure, maybe a loving figure. But again, there's this dichotomy, this paradox. What is the situation? The woman, who again is Leonor, in this instance, she is lying asleep herself, and the figure of death, which seems to be some sort of welcomed, loving figure, as opposed to a threatening skeleton, a sort of, again, subverting the basic idea that the theme has been given in works by other people, like Hans Baldwin Green with his images of Vanitas, the girl admiring herself, and then death hovering behind with the hourglass to show her that death would end all things. I wish he wouldn't do that. And here is an image where, of course, it's the same theme, but you can see that really he's using it as an excuse for a beautiful representation of the female form. I mean, to be able to paint the nude at this time was, you needed a good excuse. Maybe Eve, maybe Venus, but beautiful women in this context would be acceptable as a subject. And certain artists took things much further, like Juan Manuel Deutsch, Death and the Maiden, a sort of dance of death of 1516, the dance of death where skeletons form dances with beautiful women and then end up with sexual embraces. And here is the skeleton and the fascination of the evil and the ugly in the woman's relation to the image of death. Friendship, therefore, is final work in this survey of the way Leonor, as a woman artist, has drawn upon themes that are common to the surrealist. She has examined ideas which she, as a woman, feels are important in relation to dreams and dream analogy, in relation to self-assertion as a woman in a situation where women needed to assert themselves. And I should just end by mentioning that I actually first met Leonor, don't laugh, I first met Leonor in 1988. So I knew her quite well for the last part of her life, and by then she was very well established as a sort of great figure in Paris society, a great figure, as I say, going to balls, going to openings. The press were always interested in news about her or photographing her. Many stories grew up about her. And it just so happened that she'd been a friend of Hans Bellmer, and I was writing a book on Bellmer, and so I was given her number, so I phoned her. And I thought, surely she'll be helpful to a researcher like me. And she said, "Oh, Bellmer, he did wonderful drawings, but I hated the way he smoked gitane in my studio," and she put the phone down. So this was not a promising beginning. But I met her at dinner soon after that, and our conversation started off, "Do you like cats?" And of course I had been ready for this because, of course, I knew she was very fond of cats. So I said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you have any?" And I said, "Yes, I have 5. And she, I thought she'd be very impressed. And she said, "Well, I have 16. So it wasn't terribly helpful. And then she said, "What are the names of your cats?" And so I said, "Well, I've got Salvador Dali, and I've got Aubrey Beardsley, and I've got James Abbott McDill Whistler, and I've got, I was getting near, where I was going, Van Gogh." And then she said, "Well, that's only 4. And so I said, "Well, I'm afraid my 5th cat's called Leonorfini," and which is true. I mean, it was absolutely true. And I thought, this is dicey. And she said, "Wonderful, I've never heard of anyone calling a cat Leonorfini." And we were friends after that. And so it was a very good beginning to a wonderful friendship. The drawback was that whenever you went to, I know you want to go shortly, whenever you went to lunch with Leonor, which was very wonderful meals cooked by her own cook, her cats were given complete free run of the house, and the cats, if they wished to wander around the table while you were eating, then of course that was fine. She wouldn't hear of you trying to remove them or push them off, had no right to. So they would start nibbling at your meal, so I learned to eat very fast. Because She died in 1996, aged 88, so she didn't actually see my book, but she did see the early chapters, and I think she was quite pleased that somebody she had finally allowed somebody like me to write the book which so many people had wanted to write. Well, after her death, I went to Trieste, where she was brought up, and she had told me that there was a sphinx in the gardens of Trieste in Miramar Castle. And so I found the Sphinx, which sits there impassively in front of the castle, and I thought to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Sphinx remembered the young girl? Leonor told me she used to sit on the back of the Sphinx and dream of her future. And I thought how wonderful if the Sphinx could remember Leonor, this girl sitting on the back of the Sphinx, and in the future, whose dreams would produce some of the most extraordinary images of its forebears and of its successors of all 20th century art. Thank you very much indeed.